So, David, it's a huge task to go back over 3 decades or so of screen work, but let's go back even further. Let's go back to Bexhill-on-Sea in Sussex, and your earliest screen, most formative screen watching experience. Did you go to the cinema?
We went to the cinema a lot, my family, and it was all that period in which the British film industry was what I think Beyond the Fringe called aftermath of war, meaning that they created the legend that the British had fought the war with unfailing heroism. And every film at the Playhouse every week was Cockleshell Heroes or The Dam Busters or Reach for the Sky. And it had a huge effect on me because I just knew they weren't true. And I was very, very young, but even I could tell that this was a story that the British were telling themselves, not because they, in quotes, won the war, though obviously that was the post-war story in Britain, where, obviously 20 million people dying in Russia was never mentioned. But that also, I just could tell that what they were really about was the loss of British influence that was happening in the 1950s. And as we shrank and people took less and less notice of us, we bigged ourselves up in these movies. And that meant that the first television film that I directed was Licking Hitler, which was a late 1970s film for Play for Today. And that was a corrective, really, to try and say, I don't buy this myth that the British were uniquely heroic in the way they fought the war.
So thematically, that was what was interesting you. But were you also particularly picking up on dialogue, film dialogue, or the visual?
No, I think glamour. I was in a very boring little town in the middle of East Sussex, and I thought Dirk Bogarde was the most glamorous person that I'd ever seen in my life. And I thought Muriel Pavlov was a dream of a nurse, So Doctor in the House made a very profound effect on me. And the idea that the central surface of a film could put you in a world which was so much richer than the world that I was in Bexhill, that's what I really, really loved in the movies. And so, I fell in love with the cinema through terrible films, really. And I only started seeing good films in my teens.
And at university, maybe as well? Or not?
At university, I ran the Film Society, and because I loved film so much by then, and the highlight of the time, actually, I was secretary of the Film Society when Alfred Hitchcock came. To our surprise, we invited him, and Hitchcock said yes and came. And later I read in a biography of his that it said that Hitchcock's fortunes in the mid-60s were so low that he even accepted an invitation to go and talk at Cambridge University. And there was no sense of that. And meeting Hitchcock was just the greatest privilege and pleasure. He was just a wonderful... He is not that... there have been a couple of movies that have tried to represent him as creepy and sinister and voyeuristic and misogynistic and all these things. As someone who was privileged that afternoon to spend about 5 hours in his company, he was just the greatest raconteur and the most brilliantly entertaining and open and generous and lovely man. And I just, the myth about him that these not very good movies have created annoys me, because you just knew how incredibly clever he was, apart from anything.
So, but your ambition at that stage was stage. I mean, stage was where it was at.
No, I wanted to enter the British film industry, but as usual, the British film industry was going through one of its crises. And so I wrote to a lot of people to try and get a job. And in those days, everybody saw you. So I went to see Tony Richardson. I went to Woodfall. I went to see Clive Donner. People accepted to see you. I went to see Peter Brook. People just, if you wrote them a letter, it was so much easier then. They would answer and they'd say yes. come and meet me. But none of them had any jobs. I was going to be the runner on a film about Che Guevara that Tony Richardson was going to make with Albert Finney. But as film historians among you will know, the rival Omar Sharif project sank Tony Richardson's film about. So I never got to go to Bolivia or wherever they're going to film. And so, no, I turned to the theatre because I couldn't get a job in film.
That worked out okay.
Yeah, but film, I did get one job working for Pathé News, and I did learn to cut film. And we were asked to make educational films from the Pathé Film Library, from stock footage. And a man called Charlie Gillette, who was a wonderful person, there were two subjects. You could either do war and society or sex and society. And he had grabbed war, because in Pathé News there is a lot of footage of war. And I was stuck with Sex and Society, and there's absolutely no footage of sex in Pathé News, for those of you who remember it, which was the most sort of anodyne of the British newsreels.
Now, we're necessarily, because of the format of this, going to have to whiz through the years a bit. And we're going to head towards 1985, which in screen terms is a moment where you have two films, one of which you've written, Plenty, which was from your stage, very, very successful stage play, and the other of which we're going to see that excerpt from, is from Wetherby, which you wrote for the screen and directed as well. So this, I mean, a little bit, just to go back a little bit from that was your own company that did it, was it?
No, there was a sort of brief, people who are now dealing with Netflix and Amazon, by and large, in the film industry, power is with the industry and not with the artist. Occasionally, there are moments, which we call utopian moments, when the balance is briefly towards the artist. And that's happening at the moment with Netflix and Amazon, who are just green-lighting all these projects. And any filmmaker will tell you, I went to Netflix and it was fixed in 20 minutes, we're making it. And that is utopia. And utopia never lasts very long. We know that in 2 years' time, that window will close again. But it's been open for about 2 years now for filmmakers. And that was the same when Channel 4 was founded. It had to have a weekly film because it was going to be film-led. Every Thursday they were going to show a film which was an original British film which had also been shown in the cinema. So they needed films. So the only reason I formed a film company was because they came to me and some colleagues, Stephen Frears, Mike Newell, and asked us to form a company to make films, just so they had some films. They wouldn't have had any otherwise. They were asking everyone to form companies. And so we formed a company and we made Wetherby.
So Wetherby was, when you sat down to write a film, an original script, as opposed to adapting, one of your plays, did you feel that the principles were different in some way?
I knew absolutely nothing. It's written. We'll get to this later, but I don't think I knew anything about screenwriting at all. And I think that whereas you can become a playwright by instinct, or certainly I became a playwright by instinct, I think screenwriting you really do have to learn. Unfortunately, there is an instructional element. And I'm not sure I've ever believed that anyone was a natural screenwriter. I have believed that people are natural playwrights. And there are people whose first plays but there are very few people whose first screenplays. I think screenwriting is something you get better at the more you learn about it. And I'll talk later about who taught me screenwriting, but when I wrote Wetherby, I knew nothing at all.
So, and it's fascinating, not least because you assemble a terrific cast for it. But for those of you who haven't seen it, it is about a teacher in a Yorkshire town who lives by herself, and actually loneliness and being solitary is very much a part of, the idea is an interesting one there. And an event occurs when, after a young man comes to a dinner party that she's holding. Dinner party's a bit grand. She's got some friends coming around for supper. This young man also turns up, and everybody assumes that somebody else, in a very British way, wonderfully British way, that somebody else has brought in. And so he becomes part of their conversation. In the excerpt we're about to see now, nobody's actually rumbled that he's really nothing to do with them at all, and this will have tremendous consequences anyway. So if we could see the first clip, please. So Wetherby tied for the Golden Bear at Berlin. I mean, that's a pretty good start, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I always started well and then fell off. You know, when I made Licking Hitler, it won every award in going, and then Wetherby won every award going, and then I got less good. And I made 3 films in the 1980s. I followed this Wetherby with Paris by Night, and then Paris by Night with Strapless. And I gave up directing movies after Strapless because I felt each of the films was less good than the one I'd made before. And that was not a feeling to do with their commercial success, critical success, anything. I just felt inside myself, I felt that, in fact, Stephen Frears, who's, you know, a great friend of mine, though not always the most sympathetic of friends, certainly a brutally honest friend, said of Wetherby, it's the kind of film you make when you don't know what you're doing, and you will learn as you go along that filmmaking is much harder than it looks. And anyone can make a first film and bang, but then you have to then start the painful process. And it's true that you will observe of many British filmmakers that they have what I call a U-shaped career, meaning that they start up, they go down, and then they bump along the bottom for a long time. And then, if they're lucky, they find themselves again, and they go back up. And it isn't till you really learn about filmmaking that you can be remotely consistent in what you do, which obviously Stephen, Stephen was only speaking from his own experience and has become one of our most consistent filmmakers simply because he did go off and learn the craft. And there is a craft to learn.
So what do you remember what you learnt from, I mean, it's the ambitious thing of writing and directing as well. I mean, that's a...
Yeah.
I mean, do you remember after Wetherby what your initial feeling was about what you had to do the next time or get better the next time?
No, I think that the business of it being so easy to make a film was in fact not great. In other words, it was almost too easy to make a film at that point. Because although I object strongly and spend my whole life complaining about the rigorous process whereby a screenplay now reaches a realization, nevertheless, that process can be rigorous, and it can actually benefit a script as well as endanger it. And really, the whole art of screenwriting is being able to work out what is good advice and what is bad advice. Because often bad advice is terribly alluring and seems terribly attractive, and then good advice, you don't notice it, and then you're working and you think, oh, I remember 3 months ago somebody told me I should do such and such. And so the art of sifting advice is really what screenwriting boils down to.
So the next extract we're going to have is actually from a few years on, is from Damage from 1992, which is an adaptation of Josephine Hart's novel. So at what point, I mean, I can see that there will be things in her novel about, or elements about the British establishment that might well intrigue you. I mean, what was attractive to you about adapting somebody else's work?
What was attractive to me was Louis Malle. I just wanted to work with Louis, and I was not in the mood to do it at all because I'd just written a play, and I was exhausted. And I said to Louis Malle, I really don't want to do this. I'm totally whacked. I'm going to go and have a holiday, and I'm going to go down to Ramatuelle and lie on the beach. And he said immediately, oh, that's very interesting. I was thinking of going down to Ramatuelle myself. So why don't we meet every day and talk? So we met every day, and every day he would say, now just supposing we wrote a screenplay of this, how would you see it developing? And then he would say, tell me the story. And I would start to tell him the story, and then he'd interrogate the story. Do you see? And when we'd done that, in a day, I think we'd covered about the first 8 pages of the book, right? And next day, he said, right, let's start again. And I said, oh, we'll pick up from where I left off. He said, no, go back to the beginning. And every morning I went back to the beginning to a point where I thought I was going to kill him. But eventually I could tell the whole story in 45 minutes straight through. It took about 10 days. I had no holiday. And at the end of the 10 days, I had structured it to a point where I could tell it as a narrative from memory. And then he said, well, you've done the hard bit. Now just hang some dialogue on it, and you've written the screenplay. Yeah. And it was the most demanding way of writing a film that I've ever known, but it was also the greatest lesson I ever had in screenwriting, which was essentially structure. And that's what it is. That's what screenwriting is. It's all about the structure.
And the excerpt we're about to see is from really what is actually a tremendously cathartic moment in the film, because it is so much about things not said, secrets kept, and conversations not had even between lovers. And here is a moment where we'll see Miranda Richardson as the wife of the politician played by Jeremy Irons, and she has been so well behaved, hasn't she? She's been, again, so beautifully contained and understanding, and this is the moment where all that changes. If we could see the clip, please.
Yeah, the interesting thing about this is that it was cast by Patsy Pollock, who was a great, great casting director, and Miranda was totally unsuited to the part, apparently, meaning that she was approximately 15 or 20 years too young. She was a bohemian, really, rather than a bourgeois, not a natural player of bourgeois roles. And, when Patsy asked me about the part, I said, well, there's a scene, and that's the scene, which really has to be like Greek tragedy. And Patsy said, well, for Greek tragedy, really, you need the best actress in England. It doesn't matter if she's right for it or not. All that will matter is that scene. The rest you can do with makeup, hair, making her look older, learning the manner, behaving in a way that's not natural to Miranda, but which she's able to act. But then she'll be able to play the big scene. And it just was the best piece of casting ever, because we could have cast that part naturalistically with a, in quotes, bourgeois actress, and you would never have got anything like the power that you get from casting Miranda Richardson.
Yeah, it is, because actually, until that point in the film, you're thinking, it's Miranda Richardson, and you're sort of thinking, oh, she's not really being used. And then suddenly, wow.
That's right.
And so it is tremendous. Now, but that raises an interesting point, which is about the roles of women, because right from the beginning, we saw Vanessa Redgrave there in Wetherby, and obviously there's plenty. Women very often at the centre of your films, without actually it being particularly an issue at the time. And now people are making such a fuss about, and quite rightly so, that there are not enough films with women at the centre of it. But it is extraordinary that it has become this thing about people talking about casting strong women characters. Where, I mean, all of your women characters have been necessarily complex and interesting from the beginning.
Yeah, I think that, having lived through different waves of feminism, and obviously there was a wave of feminism in the 80s, which was actually extremely critical of my work, and which was saying, particularly of Paris by Night, which hit a wave of feminist criticism because she was an adulteress and she was a murderess, the central character. And in fact, Charlotte Rampling got sued, or rather the Observer got sued, by Edwina Currie, because Charlotte Rampling said, I play an Edwina Currie type. And Edwina Currie stood up in High Court and said, I've never committed adultery. She later then confessed that she'd been having an affair with John Major. And I've never quite understood why she never gave the money back to the Observer, or indeed why Jeffrey Archer was pursued for perjury, but she wasn't pursued for perjury. It's slightly mysterious to me. But the feminist objection was, it must be misogynist if you are representing a woman as a murderess. In other words, all films about women as murderesses are misogynist. And so what was hard in those days was to insist that I had the right to write about all kinds of women, so that if I wanted a woman to be a comedian, she could be a comedian. If I wanted to be a doctor, she could be a doctor. If she wanted to be this, well, that, the same thing. That this stereotype, which is there's only to be what this awful word, role models, meaning people who are strong, who survive every situation, et cetera, et cetera. It's just such a bore, that idea. And so if you're going to, what I've always wanted was the right to write about all kinds of women. And it is true there are far more women in my work than almost anybody else's, but that's just because there are all those women out there. And so it just seems obvious you write about them.
Yeah, and to just loop back onto that idea of the sort of role model, which seems to be quite pervasive even still now. I mean, that's quite a patronising idea, isn't it? The suggestion that, one can only see improving views of women as if you couldn't.
Well, I just think that it's untrue. I suppose that's my objection. Now, what was always said to me was, you are a progressive writer, and there aren't many progressive writers. There aren't many writers on the left. 9/10 of what you see on television or in the cinema is reactionary. You're progressive, so your job, I was told in the 1980s, your job is to represent progressive, forward-thinking, women who represent examples that we should all follow. Now, to me, we're going down the Stalinist route. If art is only there to exemplify how we should all behave. And anyway, that's not how audiences react. The idea that you go and see, and because there's somebody who is behaving in a particular way, you leave the cinema and say, well, I'll behave like that. It's so childish, that idea of art. So all you want is equal rights of representation for women as equal rights of representation for men.
Well, we're going to zip forward another decade now and to the film that you made with Stephen Daldry, The Hours, for which you're Oscar nominated for the script, where indeed you are getting, and it's another adaptation from Michael Cunningham's novel, and you are getting a good variety of women there, very sort of vividly realised. At this stage, I mean, you're a pretty experienced screenwriter by this stage. I mean, are there things by then that you've learnt, given that you're having to do 3 different periods, 3 different styles of writing, if you like?
Yes, I mean, crudely, this was, again, a little utopia, which was that I developed this film with Scott Rudin, who is a very, very brilliant producer, and we worked on the script together for 6 or 8 months, working out how these. To me, I loved the idea of the book because it left me free to do all sorts of things. For those of you who don't know the book, it's a series of interior monologues, and the wonderful excitement for me as a screenwriter was that I could invent scenes that expressed what Michael Cunningham expressed through interior monologue. So it was lovely because there was, as I would say, plenty of room in the bed. I didn't just have to, as it were, transcribe scenes from the novel. I had to invent scenes. So this was wonderful for me. And Scott produced the film, got the film together, offered it to a director, and the director said, yeah, great, I want to do it, I want to work on the script. And Scott said something which I have never heard any other producer ever say, for which I will always be grateful to him. No, the script we are making is this script. We are not interested in hiring a director to come in and alter everything. If you direct this film, you have to direct this film as written. And to have a producer say that, any of you who've ever worked on a movie will know that usually the screenwriter is the person who everyone turns to and says, now can you make it this? Now can you change this? Can you change that? Scott just said, we're going to make this movie. David and I have spent 8 months working out how to do this. It's as it is, and you shoot it as it is. And Daldry, because he's just a great man, was not threatened by that. He said, great, I love the script, I'll shoot it. And of course, he then brought everything to it and did it wonderfully. But he accepted the discipline of accepting a script and not endlessly messing around with it.
Well, the excerpt we're going to see has Nicole Kidman and Stephen Delane as Virginia and Leonard Woolf on the platform at Richmond Station. Which is a line that sometimes in cinemas gets a laugh and sometimes...
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. I read Merlin Holland, who is Oscar Wilde's grandson, and he said that he could invent an Oscar Wilde line, and he had some line about the truth is the truth pure and simple, the truth is rarely pure and rarely simple. And actually, Merlin Holland wrote it. And it is now quoted in biographies as a line by Oscar Wilde. And Merlin Holland said, myth takes over so quickly. And I got a letter the other day from an academic saying, I can't seem to find this line where Virginia Woolf says, if it's a choice between Richmond and death, I choose death. Can you tell me where you found this? And I had to explain the concept that I had made this line up. That's what I do as a screenwriter. But the academic had great trouble with this concept,
And the anaesthetic of the suburbs?
And I've seen it quoted, I have seen it quoted, that, as Virginia Woolf said. And I'm very proud to have written one line of Virginia Woolf's work.
Yeah, no, because I was wondering about earlier on when she talks about the anaesthetic of the suburbs, whether that was her or Michael Cunningham or you, or maybe you can't remember by now.
I think you get to a point when you're working on a movie that you can't. I used to go round doing the publicity tour for The Hours, saying that The Hours was the most faithful adaptation of a book and that I had not strayed at all from Michael's original conception. And Scott Rudin said to me at one point, have you read Michael's book lately? And there is a very famous saying, I'm sure many people here know it, by Jean-Claude Carrière, who said, the art of film adaptation is to read the book once and then throw it in the wastepaper basket. And there is an element of truth in that. In other words, the way I put it is to say you can only be faithful by being lavishly promiscuous. You will eventually return to the spirit of the thing if you have any integrity, but you can't. You've got to go your own route, and by going your own route, you will eventually, I hope, come back to what it is the author of the book wanted at first. But there's nothing deader than an adaptation that's just transliterated the pages of the book.
Well, to continue the sort of travelling metaphor, a bit of a handbrake turn now, because we're going to talk about sort of very contemporary works, and we're going to talk about work for television, and specifically the series broadcast this year, Collateral. So this is your first original television series?
Yes.
What made you, at this point, want to move into that area?
Well, Page 8 was... I did Page 8, the Worricker film, and we all had such a wonderful time making it, and we all enjoyed it so much. Everybody said to me, please write some more. And when I'd written 3, and we'd made all films separately, they belonged together, and I thought, well, maybe I should finally have the courage to write a television series. And I'd never had the courage to do it because it involves such a huge expenditure of time. And finally, with this, I wrote originally as a film, and Christine Langan, who ran BBC Films, and who was a friend, and who I liked and respected very much, said to me, this is a TV series, it's not a film. And I said, why? And she said, because you need time with these people. And also the people that it's about won't see it in the cinema because they don't go to the cinema. The people that it's about will watch it if it's on television. And because it's about the unofficial society, the other society, the society that we don't look at, that we pass every day, the people without paperwork, who officially don't exist, the people who are here illegally or whose status is dodgy. And it was them I wanted to write about, and frankly, there was more chance of them watching it. And most of the personal stuff that I got, the appreciation I got, was really about who the film was about. And it was about people who aren't usually represented. In particular, it contains that almost unknown thing, positive portrayal of Arab characters. And the film is on Netflix, and I know from people in the Arab world that the gratitude that for once Arabs are represented as human beings, that's almost been the overwhelming response to Collateral, actually.
So the little clip that we're going to see now shows Carey Mulligan as the detective who is the basic.
Yeah.
You haven't seen it. The basic idea is there is a shooting, there is a killing, and the series follows for the 4 days and nights after that. And this is the point at which the detective. This is very early on, isn't it? And the detective is just trying to find some links to the dead man.
Yeah, and he tries to find the sister of the man who's dead. Yeah, what I'd like to say about that scene, because basically Carey Mulligan just kept saying to me, this scene isn't good enough. And she said it over and over again. And this is screenwriting. It's about collaboration and taking good advice and bad advice. She met someone whose job is to negotiate difficult situations, and she in the police, and she asked for advice on what the person would really say. And then she went back and back to me saying, this is not good enough. I don't, not in a whiny, unpleasant, objectionable way, but in the most creative way possible. And I think it may well even have been Carey herself who came up with this line about when at the end she says, all I want to say is sorry. And she makes me cry every time. I'm afraid she makes me cry when I see the scene now, because it's just so unexpected from a policewoman in that situation. And it's because I was, I'd done the job for so long that I knew that if an actor is pushing at a scene like that, not in a kind of, look at me, I want my part better, how can my part be bigger, how can it draw more attention to, but in a Carey Mulligan kind of way where you're going to say, is the audience really going to believe this? And how can I make it as good as possible? Which is, she's like a terrier. She just goes on and on at you. And so I owe that scene, which she correctly identified as the scene that will get the audience into the whole series. Once they see that scene, they know whether they want to watch the film or not. And she correctly identified that scene, and she brought all that incredible presence and brilliance she has to it.
And I suppose when you said that people who are affected by this situation, in a sense, we're all again, another of your themes, we're all interconnected, we're all implicated in this in some way, but that they will see television rather than feature films. And I suppose that also makes you think about the old thing about Goldwyn or whoever it was who said about you want a message, go for Western Union. I mean, do you think that is right? Do you think that television is the place where if not a political, if you want to just raise people's awareness or consciousness about something, is television a better medium?
No, it's not that. Look, it is just that, we can talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but it is by and large true that the writer is a more important figure in television than they are in film. I've been lucky in film in my collaborations. I'm not today going to address the endemic weaknesses of the British film industry because there are people better qualified to do that than me. But, the reason I have not worked really very much in the British film industry, I've worked a lot in Hollywood and I've worked a lot in British television. I won't work in the British film industry because it doesn't respect screenwriters. And the paradox is that, this country is full of great screenwriters, but they're all working in America, or they're working in television. And, if you said anything exemplified British film, it is by and large the absence of importance of the screenwriter in the process. And I think I better stop there.
Well, there'll be time for questions after this, but we will have to press on. Now, Wall is
Yes.
Wall is now a very daring experiment in lots of ways. In that Wall is returning to a theme which has interested you for decades now, which is the plight of the Palestinians, and it is an animation.
Yeah.
Which I think the first thing we should do, I think we should see the clip, and then I want to, because then you will understand.
Yeah, you're the first people south of the border, namely in
Edinburgh.
England, to see this.
And it is a documentary presented in an unusual format. Please show us a clip. So that is live footage treated.
It's very hard to explain this project. I wrote a monologue about the wall because I thought that it was just so extraordinary, this wall that's gone up between Israel and Palestine. And I did it as a podcast for the New York Review of Books. And a Canadian producer became convinced that it should be a full-length animated documentary cartoon. And so Cam Christensen, who is a brilliant animator, has spent the last 7 years working on this film. And those of you who know anything about animation, he was, over that 7 years, he pretty much worked alone with a man in Sebastopol who he never met. He simply Skyped him every day, and he was a computer genius. And it's a mixture of live action, motion picture capture, which is where we all stood around in Pinewood in Lycra suits with dots all over us, and pure animation and new computer technology. He says that in the 7 years since he made it, the technology has been entirely superseded, and he would now make it in a completely different way. It cost him more or less his sanity. On a project of this scale, when Gravity was being made, I walked into a room where it was being made, and there were 145 people working on computers to show you what you see in Gravity. And Cam did this with 2 people over a 7-year period. And it shows at festivals, and it is obviously, commercially unreleasable. But it is an astonishing film, and the only reason, unfortunately, that it's not in the London Film Festival is because the Canadian Film Board didn't know that if you play the Edinburgh Film Festival, you're apparently not allowed to play the London Film Festival, which is a great sadness to me, because I would love people in London to see this film. And I hope we're going to show it at the NFT in January. I hope that's the plan.
Well, what do you think it does? I mean, what other quality does it give? Then there's a kind of ghostly poetry, I thought, particularly in the evocation of place.
Yeah.
But then there is also something slightly distancing about seeing you not as you, but as a sort of version. I mean, does it make it more universal or more particular? I'm not sure.
I can't begin to describe the strangeness of this film. When they say what genre is it, I said it's that well-known genre, the animated film essay. And they say, what are the other examples of this genre? There are no others. It's been shown in animation festivals, and it's also been shown in documentary festivals. So nobody really knows how to categorize this film. And it has been shown to audiences that are hugely enthusiastic. Like the Animation Festival in Annecy, we were practically carried head high down the street as this great masterpiece. And indeed, masterpiece was used a lot in the Italian press and French press about this film. It has also been received with consummate indifference in some of the places where it's shown. And I am as bewildered by the response to this film as I am moved by the incredible effort of Cam in devoting 7 years of his life to it.
Well, let's hope we will get a chance to see it. And we're going to move on now. I'm sorry about the swiftness of this, but those are the constraints of time. To The White Crow, which had its European premiere here last night and is still showing, I think, over the weekend as well. And this is a film that you have written, directed by Ralph Fiennes, about the years about Nureyev up until the point when he defects in Paris in 1961, I think. And this is well, there are a number of things about it, one, not least of which is that much of the dialogue is in Russian.
Yeah.
So does that require a particular kind of writing?
No, it required a particular kind of finance. You know, no film in the Russian language has ever taken more than $2 million in the West. So Ralph, who absolutely insisted that everything be in the original language and you don't have the ridiculous spectacle of, you know, well-known British character actors putting on Russian accents, he, you know, knew how incredibly difficult it would be to get this film made, given that it's hardly a commercial proposition. It's made on a huge scale. And in fact, seeing the film last night at the premiere on a huge screen at the Embankment, I was amazed at the scale of it for the amount of money that I know it cost to make. You know, every single penny is on the screen. Because it is, you know, moving between Russia and the Paris of the 1960s, which is not a cheap thing to do. And so it's a very, very ambitious recreation of that period.
Well, the little bit that we're going to see is actually at the point when the young dancer has completed his training in Leningrad and is hoping, obviously, to join one of the big Russian, either Kirov or Bolshoi, one of the big Russian companies, national companies, but instead is about to have an interview about his future.
Yeah. I mean, people who, when Nureyev defected, a number of people said to me, the act of defection was not actually as courageous as the day that he went to the Moscow Ministry of Culture and refused to go back to his hometown. And I tried to present the argument as strongly as I could that, you know, they had a perfect right to tell him not to dance in the metropolitan cities, but to go back to the place he came from. And he refused to go back to the place he came from. And people said to me, if you knew the Russian system at that time, that in a way required a courage that was just as great as the courage that was required to defect to the West 4 or 5 years later.
Very good subtitles, if I may say so.
Beautiful subtitles, aren't they?
The best, I've seen. Well, it's, you know, sometimes with the subtitles aren't always so great, and those are really, really good. But I suppose that little line about artistic strategy.
Yeah.
Is that your observation as well?
No, what the film is trying to do is talk about dictatorship and how you survive in dictatorship. And the film is trying to show the Soviet system as it was. And in particular, there's a very, I hope, original portrayal of a KGB man. You know, Ralph and I were both determined that the KGB would not be represented in the usual way of sort of cigar-smoking thugs, utterly without any sensibility at all. They were people who were as much playing the system, maneuvering around the system, trying to live in the fetid air of dictatorship and get some oxygen as the artists were. And I was trying, as I think when I saw the film Cold War, I think he's trying to do the same thing, which is to talk about those dictatorships in a way which is a little more mature than it used to be. And at least to understand, you know, Nureyev, when he defected, it was not the Stalinist time. People were no longer being sent to the Gulag. Yeah, the system was still cruel, but the predominant feeling in the late 50s and 60s was that it was a period of liberal reform, and Russia was beginning to catch up. And, you know, the bad times were felt to be behind. So it was not a case of, in these awful cliches surrounding Nureyev, a case of a leap to freedom. It was much more that as somebody who wanted to be a student of dance and was an autodidact who wanted to be able to express himself through dance, the opportunities for expressing himself through dance, he always knew were going to be greater in the West than they were in the more rigid Soviet repertory. And the film is about the complexity of all that rather than the sort of simple-minded propaganda that went on at the time.